I was sitting on the porch of my old lakeside cottage when my son called. His voice was rushed, anxious, the way it got only when he wanted something. "Mom, I need your cottage's collateral," he said. "Just for a loan. Temporary, I swear." My stomach tightened. That cottage was the only place that truly belonged to me. My late husband and I built it board by board. Every memory lived in those walls. But my son pushed harder. "It's just to help me get a business deal. I'll pay everything back. The cottage will stay yours. It's safe, Mom." Against my better judgment, and because a mother's love can be painfully blind, I agreed. A week later he arrived, but he wasn't alone. A woman followed him up the path, stepping out of a sleek black SUV. A realtor. My heart dropped. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom," he started, we're gonna have to sell it. The loan people want—" "No," I said. "This cottage isn't for sale." The realtor gave a polite smile that felt like poison. "Mom, your son already signed the preliminary paperwork. If you sign here, we can close in a week. You'll get a fair price." I looked at my son, searching his face for the boy I raised, and instead saw a man cornered by his own choices. He had gambled away more than money. He had gambled my trust. "You lied to me," I said softly. He didn't deny it. They left angry when I refused to sign. My son slammed the car door hard enough to shake the windows. He didn't call. He didn't visit. For 3 long months, the cottage was quiet except for the lap of the lake and the hum of the wind. Then one afternoon, I heard a car crunching up the gravel drive. My son stepped out, but he looked smaller, tired, humbled. Behind him was no realtor, no expensive car, just him. And the moment he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. "Mom, please, I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "I lost everything. I should never have tried to use your cottage. I should never have lied. Please, as I need you." He fell to his knees right there on the porch. I had warned him not to climb with muddy shoes when he was 5. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at him, the son I loved, the son who betrayed me, the son who finally understood the value of what he almost destroyed. After a long silence, I said, "This cottage is the only thing I have left that hasn't broken me. I won't lose it for anyone, not even you." He cried harder, begging, really begging this time, not for the cottage, but for forgiveness, and forgiveness that I could give. But my cottage, that would always stay mine. 3 months earlier he arrived with a realtor to take it from me. 3 months later he came back on his knees, asking only for my love. And that was the real revenge, quiet, simple, and undeniable. He learned what mattered, and what never, ever should have been gambled. When my son first called to ask if he could use my cottage as collateral, I remember the exact feeling that settled in my chest, an uneasy mix of love, fear, and the instinctive suspicion a parent feels when something simply doesn't sound right. I was sitting on the porch swing at the time, staring out at the lake that had carried so many of my life's memories. The boards beneath me creaked softly, worn from decades of footsteps, storms, laughter, and tears. This cottage had become more than a building. It was the last piece of my past that remained untouched, the final physical link to my late husband and the life we had built together. So when the phone rang and I heard the anxious tremor in my son's voice, my hand tightened on the armrest. He said he needed help. Those were his first words. Not hello, not how are you, just, "Mom, I really need your help." The desperation in his tone was enough to make my heart instinctively lean toward him. He had always known how to reach me, how to tug at the part of me that would never stop being his mother. But even with the concern rising within me, I felt a cautious pause before I answered. Problems don't knock softly, not when they're big. And whatever he wanted, I could sense it was big. He danced around the subject at first, as if trying to shape a lie into something that sounded like the truth. "It's nothing serious," he said, "just something I need temporarily." But I had been his mother far too long to be fooled by vague assurances. My son had a history of financial impulsiveness, bets on business ventures that promised quick returns but delivered slow ruin, loans he could barely repay, credit cards that bled interest. Still, he was my child, and a mother's hope is often stronger than her memory. "It's the cottage," he finally said. "I need to use it as collateral for a loan, just for a few weeks. Maybe a couple months." My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at the cottage, the chipped white paint, the rocking chairs my husband carved, the tiny bell over the screen door that jingled every time someone entered. My entire life was in that cottage. Every memory I had left, and the thought of handing it over made my skin crawl with dread. "I don't know," I whispered. That was when he pressed harder. Mom, this deal could change everything for me. I'm finally close to getting back on my feet. All I need is this one loan. The cottage will stay in your name. Nothing bad will happen. I promise. Promises come cheap when spoken too quickly. But the pain in his voice, the mixture of pride swallowed and desperation exposed, softened me. I imagined him cornered, struggling, embarrassed to even ask. Motherhood doesn't disappear with age, it shifts, grows heavier, more tender. And the idea of letting him fall alone felt unbearable. So against the voice in my head warning me that something was wrong, I said yes. He sounded relieved, almost too relieved. The kind of relief that suggests he wasn't just hoping for my help, he was counting on it. Maybe he already believed I would say yes. Maybe he thought I always would. That realization struck me later, but at the time, all I heard was his gratitude. After we ended the call, I sat alone for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the lake breeze and the occasional bird calling from the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had opened a door I wasn't prepared to walk through. I tried to reassure myself with his words, temporary, safe, nothing bad will happen, but they were thin comfort. My son had always been more confident than careful. Yet I told myself that helping him was what family did, that maybe this time would be different, that people grow, they learn, they change. And maybe he had, or maybe I simply wanted to believe he had. That night I walked through the cottage slowly, touching the walls, the old photographs, the blanket my husband and I bought on our first anniversary. I whispered to the empty rooms, telling them everything would be fine. I even convinced myself for a brief moment. I reminded myself that a mother's love sometimes meant taking risks, and this was, after all, for my son. But deep down, buried beneath all the layers of affection and loyalty, something inside me knew the truth. When a grown child comes asking for the one thing you can't replace, the thing you cherish most, it's rarely just a small favor. It is almost always the beginning of a storm. I didn't know then just how big that storm would be. I didn't know he would show up with a Realtor, or that I would soon feel the sharp sting of betrayal. All I knew was that my son had asked for my most precious possession, and despite every warning bell ringing in my heart, I said yes. Because sometimes love makes fools of us. And sometimes the price of that foolishness is almost everything we hold dear. The day my son arrived with the Realtor is a memory that still feels sharp, like splinters lodged under the skin. I had been expecting him, yes, but only him. He told me he wanted to go over a few things about the loan, and though I felt uneasy, I tried to prepare myself to be patient and trusting. What I had not prepared for was seeing a stranger step out of the passenger side of his car, dressed in a fitted blazer and holding a shiny leather folder as if she owned the place already. The moment I saw her, my heart dipped low in my chest. Something was wrong, terribly, undeniably wrong. My son waved awkwardly, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The Realtor walked ahead of him, her heels clicking against the old wooden steps like tiny hammers driving nails into my peace. She scanned the property with quick, sharp movements. Her eyes darted across the yard, the porch, the lake view. I knew that look instantly. It was the assessing gaze of someone who wasn't just admiring the place. She was pricing it. I waited on the porch, my hand resting on one of the posts my husband had sanded himself. My son avoided my eyes as he approached, and that alone told me more truth than any words he could have spoken. "Mum," he said quietly, "this is Melissa. She's just here to explain things better." Explain or sell? I felt the question burning on my tongue, but I held it for a moment, hoping desperately that I was wrong. Melissa stepped forward with a bright, practiced smile. "Mrs. Dada, it's so nice to meet you. Your son has told me so much about this cottage. It's absolutely charming, and the market for lakefront properties is very strong right now. You're in a wonderful position. A wonderful position." My jaw tightened. I had not invited this woman here. I had not asked for appraisals or market strengths or positions. All I wanted was for my son to handle whatever loan he had promised was harmless. But that promise was already unraveling like old rope. "I'm sorry," I said slowly, "but why exactly are you here?" My son finally looked at me then, and the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. He swallowed hard. "Mom, things have changed. The loan people want more security than I thought, and Melissa thinks we can sell the cottage quickly, for a really good price. It'll solve everything." The words felt like a punch straight to the chest. Sell the cottage. The cottage, he said, would stay safe, untouched. Mine. I felt my breath escape me in a shaky exhale. "No," I said immediately firmly. "This cottage isn't for sale." Melissa tried to soften her voice. Ma'am, I understand the emotional attachment. Truly I do. But think of the benefits. Your son will be able to clear his debts, restart his business, and you'll have a significant amount of money from the sale. It's a smart move. Her tone was polished, professional, and utterly detached from the value of what she was discussing. Money could not buy back memories. It could not rebuild a home built with love. It could not replace the last place where my husband's laughter still seemed to linger in the walls. I turned to my son, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or remorse. Instead, I found a man cornered by his own poor decisions, pushing his desperation onto me. You signed something, didn't you? I asked quietly. He looked away, jaw tight. Just preliminary papers. They don't mean anything unless you sign too. But they meant something to me. They meant he had lied, not just once, but repeatedly. They meant he had planned this, at least partly. He hadn't just stumbled into this situation. He had walked into it knowing he was dragging me along behind him. Mom, please, he said, suddenly more urgent. This is my chance. Don't ruin this for me. Ruin it for him. The absurdity of that almost made me laugh. If I hadn't felt like crying instead. Melissa began pulling papers out of her folder, spreading them neatly across my porch table, like a magician laying out a trick she'd performed 100 times. If you'll just review and sign here, she said, tapping a line, we can begin the process immediately. I stared at the papers but did not touch them. My hands stayed firmly by my sides, gripping the fabric of my shirt to keep them from trembling. This cottage is not being sold, I said again, voice steady now. I won't sign anything. My son's face reddened with frustration. Mom, for once, can you think about someone other than yourself? That sentence hit harder than any betrayal that day. For years I had supported him, financially, emotionally, through every misstep. And now, because I refused to give up the last thing I had left, I was selfish. The sting of that accusation burned deep. I'm thinking about the little boy I raised, I said softly. The one I thought would never treat me like this. Silence fell, thick and heavy. Melissa slowly collected her papers, realizing the deal was lost. My son's anger simmered without direction. He didn't lash out again, but he didn't apologize either. They left in a flurry of forced politeness and slamming car doors. I watched their car disappear down the gravel road, the dust rising behind it like a fading cloud. The porch felt colder, the air heavier. For the first time in my life, I felt a distance between me and my child that I wasn't sure could ever be bridged. The betrayal wasn't in the paperwork. It wasn't even in the attempt to sell my home. It was in knowing that he'd been willing to bring a stranger to the place where his father and I once dreamed, to sign away something he never truly valued, because he assumed I would always bend for him. But not this time. Not for this. Not ever again. When I refused to sign the papers that day, it wasn't anger that held my hand still. It was heartbreak. A feeling so deep and quiet that it settled inside me like a cold stone. My son stood there, staring at me as if I were the obstacle in his life instead of the mother who had carried him through every failure and every crisis. The realtor shuffled awkwardly beside him, her folder pressed to her chest, clearly realizing the deal she had been promised was slipping through her fingers. But my eyes were only on my son, searching for a glimmer of understanding, of remorse, of the boy I had raised. What I saw instead was frustration and a stubborn, entitled determination. Mom, why are you doing this? He asked, disbelief etched into every word. It stung how quickly he turned my refusal into a personal attack. As though the cottage had always been his to bargain with, and I was the unreasonable one for not wanting to let go of the last piece of my life that had remained steady. The cottage was more than timber and nails. It was memories, laughter, grief, and healing. It was the echo of my husband's voice in the kitchen, the worn path where my grandson used to toddle, the quiet evenings I spent reading by the fire when the world outside felt too loud. But he didn't see any of that. He saw only what he wanted. It's just a property, he insisted, waving his hands toward the cabin. Why do you care so much? You don't even live here full time anymore. That sentence hit a nerve I didn't expect. Not because it wasn't true, but because of the way he said it, as if my absence somehow meant the place no longer had a heartbeat for me, as if love faded simply because time had passed. It's not just a property, I said, my voice shaking. This cottage was your father's dream. We built this with our own hands. Every board, every step. I won't let it go. Not like this. For a brief moment, the realtor stepped forward as if she might intervene, but my son held up a hand to stop her. His jaw was tight, his eyes sharp with desperation and pride tangled together. "You're overreacting," he muttered. "I just need this. Why can't you help me? Why can't you trust me?" Trust. The irony of that word almost made me laugh. He was asking me to trust him while standing on my porch with a realtor behind him, without warning, without honesty, with paperwork he had already signed behind my back. "Trust goes both ways," I whispered. His face twisted in irritation. For the first time, I saw clearly the difference between asking for help and demanding it. He wasn't making a request, he was trying to corner me emotionally, hoping guilt and love would force my hand. "I can't believe this," he said, shaking his head. "You're throwing away my chance. You're supposed to be my mother?" "I am your mother," I replied softly but firmly, "and that's exactly why I won't sign." He didn't understand, not then. In his mind, love meant sacrifice, even unreasonable sacrifice. He believed that because I had always helped him before, I would continue doing so indefinitely, no matter the cost to myself. But the cottage was different. The cottage held my past, my healing, my peace, and I would not trade my peace for his reckless desperation. The realtor finally broke her silence, stepping forward with her professional smile stretched thin. Her messes. "Duh, if we could just sit down and go over the numbers, I'm sure we can find a solution that." "No," I said, rising from my chair. "There is no solution here. Not for you. Not today." My refusal settled heavily in the air. Even the wind seemed to still for a moment. My son let out a frustrated noise, somewhere between a sigh and a growl, and turned toward the steps. "Let's go." He snapped at the realtor. She followed quickly, grateful to escape the tension. He paused before getting into the car, his hand on the door. He looked at me, but his eyes were cold, wounded, prideful. "You'll regret this," he said. It was the kind of sentence meant to bruise, and it did, but it didn't break me. I watched the car back down the gravel path, dust rising behind it like a fading storm. When the silence finally returned, I sank back onto the porch. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of everything that had just happened. I had always imagined that betrayal would feel loud, like shouting, like slammed doors, like shattered glass. But in reality, it felt quiet, numb, like a slow ache in the chest that settles so deep you're unsure when it even began. My refusal wasn't about money, nor stubbornness, nor anger. It was about drawing a boundary I should have drawn years earlier. By refusing to sign, I reclaimed not just my cottage, but the part of myself I had spent years giving away unconditionally. The part that believed love meant never saying no. The part that made excuses for lies and minimized mistreatment in the name of family. I cried that night, not for the cottage, but for the realization that my son had become someone who thought I was expendable. Someone who thought my memories, my peace, and my home were bargaining chips for his poor decisions. But the cottage remained mine, and for the first time in a long while, I chose myself. After they drove away that day, my son furious, the realtor embarrassed, the dust settling behind their car like a final insult, the silence that returned to the cottage felt heavier than it ever had before. The porch, once a place of comfort, suddenly seemed too big, too empty. I sat there long after their taillights disappeared, my hands folded in my lap, wondering how things had reached a point where my own child could stand in front of me and accuse me of selfishness for protecting the very thing I had spent a lifetime building. I told myself he would call, he would come to his senses, he would realize what he'd done and return with an apology or at least an explanation. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and in that time, he didn't reach out once. The initial shock slowly gave way to an aching kind of grief, a grief not for the cottage, but for the relationship I thought we had. I tried to push the feelings aside by tending to the garden, reorganizing the shed, repainting the porch steps. But every quiet moment seemed to whisper the same question: why didn't he come back? He had always been impulsive, yes, always hopeful about the next business idea, the next opportunity, the next gamble he believed would turn everything around. But he had also always known he could come to me, talk to me, lean on me. And now he had turned away, not because he couldn't talk, but because he wouldn't. Because I had said no. It wasn't until the second month passed that the anger began to fade, replaced by a painful kind of clarity. I realized then that my son wasn't avoiding me only out of anger. He was avoiding the consequences of his own actions. Facing me meant facing what he had tried to do. Facing me meant acknowledging that he had lied, manipulated, and involved a stranger in betraying his own mother. Some truths are too heavy to confront, even for grown children. Every morning I checked my phone, even though it rarely rang. I told myself I wouldn't think about it anymore, but the heart has its own schedule, and mine was on its own timeline. The cottage became my companion in that loneliness. I walked its rooms, the creaking floorboards familiar and grounding. I cooked meals my husband used to love, though I ate them alone. I spent evenings on the porch swing, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves, wondering if he missed me, even a little. But as the days grew colder, I began to understand something important: distance can be a teacher. And in those 3 months, I learned more about love, boundaries, and motherhood than I had in decades. I learned that love without limits becomes a map for someone else to misuse. That sometimes, the people we love most will ask for the very things that will break us. And that sometimes, the bravest thing a mother can do is refuse. My son's silence became the consequence he had earned, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because some lessons can only be learned through quiet. And in that quiet, I began to reclaim pieces of myself I didn't know I'd lost. I read books I'd put off for years. I fixed the old birdhouse. I planted new flowers by the garden path. The cottage, once threatened, became a sanctuary again. Still, on certain evenings, I would catch myself imagining him walking up the path, head bowed the way he did when he was younger and needed help after making a mistake. I wondered if he was eating enough, if he was sleeping, if he had dug himself deeper into trouble. The worry never fully left, it simply settled beside me like an old companion. A mother's heart never truly stops beating for her child, even when bruised. By the end of the 3rd month, the loneliness had softened into acceptance. I no longer checked my phone first thing in the morning. I no longer held my breath at the crunch of gravel, waiting for a car that never came. I told myself that maybe this was how things were supposed to unfold. Maybe this was the distance needed for both of us to grow. But one afternoon, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea warming my hands, I felt a familiar pang, one that told me something was shifting. A car pulled up the drive, old and dusty, not the shiny one from months ago. My heart stuttered before it steadied. The door opened slowly. It was him. He didn't walk with the same arrogance as before. He didn't carry paperwork or bring a stranger to do his talking. He looked smaller, older, and weighed down by something that humbled him far more than my refusal ever did. In that moment, those 3 months of silence suddenly made sense. He hadn't been punishing me. He had been lost in the consequences of his own choices, lost in pride, lost in mistakes he couldn't undo without swallowing the pride that had almost destroyed everything. When his eyes met mine, the distance between us, the 3 months of hurt, anger, and grieving, folded into a single truth. He had finally come back, not to take something, not to demand, not to manipulate, but to face what he had done. And in that moment, I realized that sometimes the most powerful revenge is not anger, nor punishment, nor bitterness. Sometimes, it is simply letting someone walk away long enough to find their way back humbled. When my son finally returned after those long, heavy months, I could see from the moment he stepped out of the car that life had humbled him in ways my words never could. His shoulders sagged, not with the confident stride he once had, but with the weight of consequences he could no longer outrun. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes, always so full of determination, sometimes arrogance, now looked tired, bruised by reality. Seeing him like that was a shock that cut through every layer of anger I had built up. He wasn't the proud, defensive man who had stood on my porch demanding I sign away my cottage. He looked like a child again, lost and scared, searching for some place where he still belonged. He paused at the bottom of the steps, as if asking for permission to come closer. I didn't say anything, but I didn't turn away either. That was enough. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked up the steps and stopped right in front of me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile this time, it was fragile, like a thin sheet of ice stretched between us. When he finally opened his mouth to speak, his voice cracked on the very first word. Mom. Just that single word carried 3 months of shame, regret, exhaustion, and a desperation he could no longer hide. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly, and I watched as the tears he had been trying so hard to hold back finally broke free. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice trembling. I'm so sorry. He lowered his head and then, right there on the porch where he had once raised his voice at me, he sank to his knees. The sound of his knees hitting the wooden boards echoed louder than anything he had said on the day he tried to take the cottage. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't forced. It was the raw collapse of a man who had finally reached the end of his pride. Mom, please, he said, hands trembling. I messed up everything. I thought I could fix it. I thought I was smart enough, or lucky enough, but everything fell apart. His words spilled out in broken pieces. He told me how the business deal collapsed, how the loan he chased turned into a trap, how he couldn't keep up with the payments, how collectors started showing up, how he had sold the nicer car, moved into a cheaper place, lost friends who had once cheered his risky deals. Every step he had taken after leaving my cottage had been the wrong one, and each misstep had chipped away at his confidence until nothing was left. I didn't come sooner because I was ashamed, he admitted. I didn't know how to face you. I hurt you, and then everything went wrong anyway. I didn't deserve forgiveness. I still don't. He covered his face with his hands, and in that moment, he was no longer the man who had tried to use my cottage as a bargaining chip. He was the boy I had raised, the boy who used to run to me after scraping his knee, the boy who believed I could fix anything with a hug and a warm meal. Please, he said again, voice muffled. I need you, Mom, not your money, not the cottage, you. The simplicity of that sentence broke something open inside me. For the first time in months, my heart softened, not because I excused what he had done, but because he finally understood the truth. What he needed was not a property, or a loan, or a quick fix. He needed humility. He needed accountability. He needed to come home, not to take, but to heal. Without speaking, I reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder. He froze, then slowly lowered his hands, looking up at me with red, wet eyes. The relief on his face was so pure, so unguarded, that it nearly brought me to tears as well. I forgive you, I said quietly. The words surprised even me. They weren't said in weakness, or out of guilt, or pressure. They came from strength, strength I didn't know I had until I needed it. His breath shuddered as he let out a sob, leaning forward and resting his forehead gently against my knee. He wasn't begging for the cottage this time. He wasn't bargaining. He was simply my son, humbled and broken, trying to find his way back. You don't have to fix everything right away, I told him. You just need to start again, one step at a time. He nodded, still crying softly. Those 3 months had changed him. They had stripped away his pride, his stubbornness, his constant rush for shortcuts and risky success. They had left behind a man who finally understood the consequences of his actions, and the value of the people who had loved him through all of them. I didn't welcome him back with conditions. I didn't lecture him. I didn't bring up the hurt he caused. I didn't need to. His silence, his tears, his exhaustion, all of it was enough to show me that life had already taught him the lessons I never could. In that moment, I realized something profound. Sometimes life breaks someone in all the places where arrogance used to live, so humility and wisdom can grow there instead. And sometimes, the only thing a mother can do is wait until the child who once walked away finally comes home, not to claim what isn't his, but to reclaim who he truly is. When he finally lifted his head, after apologizing and crying in a way I had not seen since he was a little boy, there was a moment, just a quiet, simple moment, where everything between us shifted. Not erased, not forgotten, but transformed. He wasn't there to ask for the cottage anymore. He wasn't there to negotiate, convince, demand, or manipulate. He wasn't standing tall with papers in hand, trying to justify a reckless plan. He was simply a son who had fallen far, far enough to understand the difference between wanting something and needing something. And what he needed now was not property. It was forgiveness, stability, love, and a place to breathe again. I don't want the cottage, he whispered, voice raw. I don't want anything from you except another chance. Those words were like a soft wind passing through a broken window, gentle, but reminding me of the damage that had already been done. Still, there was truth in them. Truth I had been waiting 3 long months to hear. He sat beside me on the porch steps then, wiping his face with the back of his hand, embarrassed but no longer trying to hide. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the lake, and for a moment the world felt still, calm, like the universe had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. We didn't speak for several minutes. We just sat together, listening to the sound of the water brushing gently against the shore. And in that silence, 1,000 unspoken apologies, regrets, and realizations filled the space between us. Finally, he said, "You were right, Mom. About everything. About the cottage and about me." It didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like healing, slow, fragile, but real. He told me about the months after he left. How everything he had relied on, friends, money, confidence, fell away piece by piece until he was left facing the truth he had been avoiding for years. He had been running from responsibility, thinking shortcuts and risks would save him. But they never did. They only pushed him further into debt, deeper into panic, and farther away from the life he wanted. I was angry at you, he admitted. I told myself you were cruel. But the truth is, I was angry at myself. I hated what I had become. And coming back meant facing all of that. Growth doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it drags a person through the dirt before they finally rise again. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. Part of me wanted to hold him, tell him everything would be okay. Part of me wanted to remind him of the hurt he caused. But a larger, wiser part of me understood something deeper. This moment wasn't about the past. It was about the future. You don't have to earn my love, I finally said. You already have it. But trust that takes time. He swallowed hard and nodded. I know, and I'm willing to earn that. There it was, the difference. Months earlier, he had expected everything from me: trust, belief, sacrifice, the cottage itself. Now, he wasn't asking for anything except the opportunity to rebuild. And he was willing to do it slowly, humbly, step by step. That was the true revenge of life, not anger, not punishment, but transformation. Life had humbled him in the exact places he once stood tallest. It had broken the arrogance that controlled him and left room for something better to grow. I want to do better, Mom, he said. Not because I want something, but because I want to become someone I'm proud of again. Someone you're proud of. My eyes stung, but I blinked the tears away. Not because I wanted to seem strong, but because the moment was already tender enough. I'm always proud of you, I said, even when I don't like what you're doing. He let out a shaky laugh, small but genuine, and in that laugh I heard hope returning, just a little. A spark instead of a flame, but still warm. We talked for a long time, longer than we had in years. He confessed things he had been too ashamed to say before. I told him truths I had held in my heart for far too long, and slowly, gently, without force or pressure, the bond between us began to mend. When the sun began to set, he finally stood. For the first time in months, he looked me in the eye without fear or defensiveness. Thank you for not selling the cottage, he said quietly. I thought you were being stubborn, but you were protecting something I didn't understand. And now I get it. I nodded. I protected it because it mattered, and because someday, when you understand its value, I want you to appreciate it, not own it. He smiled softly. I think I do now. As he walked back to his car, there was no anger in his steps, no pride, no false confidence, just a man beginning again. And in that moment I realized something important. 3 months earlier, he came to my cottage to take it from me. 3 months later, he returned to give something far greater back: his humility, his honesty, and the first true apology of his adult life. And that was how forgiveness, not revenge, finally healed us both.